At this point, Hubert's life began to get a little bit better. When they moved to Wichita, they moved next door to a Seventh-day Adventist family. Arthur, the husband, had a speech impediment. But that didn't give him cause to stop giving Bible studies, and he gave Bible studies to Velma and Hubert. Velma was convicted right away. Hubert was too. Velma was baptized. Hubert was not, because he had some habits that he needed to overcome. After the war, he ran with kind of a rough crowd, and he realized that even though he was convicted, that in order to follow his conviction, he needed to change the crowd that he ran with, and Arthur came to the rescue one more time. Arthur's brother owned a farm in southeast Kansas, and he wanted to sell the farm so that he could become a full-time literature evangelist. Hubert and Velma bought the farm. Hubert was baptized in 1947. That was the year I was born. Hubert was my dad. I can't tell you how many times I've heard him quote the scripture, 1 Peter 2, verse 10. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness. Hubert considered himself to be called out of darkness. I still have the 1897 12-gauge Winchester that my dad got when he was 11 years old. He was a crack shot with it. I fired it a few times. I'm no good with it. But then it's never been my responsibility to put food on the table either. Well, what about Arthur, the man with a speech impediment? I never could understand what he was saying. When he would talk, I'd look at my dad, and my dad would interpret for him. So why this story? Because I want to say a few words about Christian education. My dad became an advocate for Christian education. I was a third of 4 siblings. We lived far out in the country where we never had the privilege of attending an Adventist elementary school, but it was understood that we would be going to academy. My older brother, was the first to go. First home leave came around. Students in our district carpooled. When the car came to pick up my brother, he told my dad, "I'm homesick. I don't like academy. I'm not going back." Then a little scene occurred, which I've never forgotten. My dad, who's quite a bit smaller than I am, walked over to my brother. He picked him up, carried him to the car, opened the back door of the car, put him in with the other hand, said, "You are going back." Well, that was the end of the discussion about where the rest of us were going to go to school for high school years. By the way, my brother, his academy days were the highlight of his life. He talked about them all his life and sent his 4 children to the same academy. Well, I went off to academy. First home leave came around. It was a Sunday morning. I was helping my dad fill silo. I loved machinery. I loved the roar of equipment. 2:30 in the afternoon, we knocked off. The car came to pick me up. I told my dad, "I'm homesick. I'd like to stay home." My dad looked at me. I looked at him. I said, "I will go back, though." He wasn't going to carry me to the car. Well, the question needs to be asked. How does one on a small farm finance a Christian education for 4 kids? The answer was big sacrifice. Mom took a job as a nurse at a tuberculosis sanitarium. She worked 3 to 11 shift. Dad's day started every morning at 4:45. He milked 18 to 26 cows, and by 7:30 that same morning he would be off at work as a bridge construction foreman. 5:30 in the evening, same routine, came home, milked the cows. We kids helped. During the summer, my sisters milked cows for the neighbors. My brother and I worked for a neighboring farmer. The week before school started, on Thursday night, I drew my paycheck for the whole summer. Went to town, bought the clothes I needed to get me through the school year. Sunday morning, I plunked whatever was left down the business manager's desk at the academy. We were part of the one bath generation. That's one bath a week. We didn't have running water in the house, no TV, no phone, until my junior year in the academy. 3 years after I graduated from Union College, my dad made a final payment on the farm, and he shut down the milkers forever. Through all this, my dad's rheumatic fever, his heart, never gave him a bit of trouble. I always said it was because he had a high and noble purpose in life. Then out of the blue, he called me one day. He said, "Something's wrong." I get winded. Just go into the mailbox. You guessed it. It was his heart. In a few weeks, he was gone. Well, was it worth the sacrifice? I think it was. We 4 siblings were not perfect. We made our share of missteps, but all 4 continued as supporters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. My sister and I together have spent over 50 years on campuses of academies. Now to the floating axe head. What do we know about the school of the prophets? We know that they were established by the prophet Samuel. A number of schools were mentioned in the scriptures. Instruction at these schools seemed to center around 2 themes. Instruction in the law, full scriptures were not available yet, and instruction regarding loyalty to the Creator God, the God of heaven. You remember the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel and how he had a signal victory there with God's blessing over the prophets of Baal. But after that, he lapsed, fled into the wilderness. After being there 40 days, God came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah said, "Well, I'm ready to pack it in. I'm the only one left in Israel that follows you. Just go ahead and let me die." God said, "Nope, you're wrong about that, Elijah. There's 7,000 others who have not bowed the knee to Baal." Those 7,000 others were there because of the school of the prophets. Well, Elisha now receives the call of God to be Elijah's replacement. Elijah goes up in a chariot of fire. But before that happened, Elisha and Elijah visited the school of the prophets. Apparently there was a revival of their relevance. Enrollment increased, and that set the scene for our scripture today. The story of the floating axe head. The story starts with students saying, "Hey, we're too crowded. Let's enlarge our campus." 2 aspects of the story I'd like to explore this morning. God's providence, first one is, God's providences and even the miracles accompany the building up of his work. And the second aspect I'd like to explore is our schools today need to consider themselves to be schools of the prophets, have the same goals, the same mission. We'll deal with them in that order. I'd like to relate some providences of God that were seen in the founding of Sunnydale Academy. Beginning in the early 1940s, there was a movement of the constituents of Missouri to have their own boarding school. They counseled with the brethren at the union level, at the general conference level, and were given 3 objections. The conference constituency was considered to be too small. It was about 5,000. There was no money for such a large undertaking, and the students of Missouri could attend neighboring state schools, neighboring academies, and in fact some of them already were. That did not quiet the movement. In the spring of 1945, under the direction of Elder Hutchins, the conference president, an academy committee was formed. It consisted of 10 men from the local conference, from the union conference, and from the general conference. Ads were placed in the Kansas City paper and in the St. Louis paper to advertising for a site where a school could be built. A number of responses were received. The committee set aside 10 days, and they would visit the various sites and make a recommendation to the constituency. The 2 weeks were almost up. They'd come to no agreement on a building site. The entourage of 2 vehicles stopped just outside of Moberly, Missouri, for rest. Some of the brethren took Elder Hutchins, who was the conference president, aside, and they said, "Tell the constituents to forget this school business." Elder Hutchins came back with a bold reply. He said, "If I do that, my work here is done. I won't be able to continue my ministry in Missouri. If I don't do that, I'm probably going to be in trouble with the union and the GC." It got very quiet. Then Elder Neil Wilson, who was the president of the union conference, spoke up. And he said, "Brother Hutchins, you do what you think best. We'll not stand in your way." Sunnydale Academy was born that day. They got back in their cars and headed to the last site that they were supposed to visit. It was a farm just outside of Centralia, Missouri. It was owned by an entrepreneur in Centralia, and he had built the farm up as a hobby farm. As they drove past the farm, the demeanor of the men changed. The brethren from the general conference said, "Brother Hutchins, if you could get a farm like that, we might be in favor of it." Decision was made to go and visit with the owner, a fellow by the name of A.B. Chance, and Elder Hutchins was selected to be the spokesperson. Mr. Chance told them that he had $500,000 in that farm, and that he would consider selling it, or was advertising it for sale, at 50 cents on the dollar, $250,000. When he was presented with the idea of a school being built there, he immediately came down to $125,000. Negotiations continued, and eventually he came down to $75,000. In the fall, at the GC session, time was made for discussion of the Missouri school proposition. 3 days went by. Talks were stalled. They had $70,000 committed. Elder Hutchins returned to his hotel room at the end of that 3rd day. Not knowing what to do, late in the evening, he telegrammed Mr. Chance, the owner of the property, and asked him if he would be willing to take $70,000. 2:30 in the morning, there was a knock on the door. It was the bellboy, had a telegram, and here's what the telegram said: "Must have that school. It's yours. $70,000. Well, what did they get for $70,000? 865 acres of farmland, 5 tractors and the equipment to go with it, 6 trucks, 139 Holstein milk cows with a dairy barn, silos, and everything to go with it, 100 goats, and on top of that, 150 head of hogs." Sunnydale was dubbed our Miracle School. That was October 18, 1945. The goal was to open school in September of 1946, 11 months away. I see somebody shaking their head yes back there. Well, the hogs were the first to go, of course. Then the goats. There was a catastrophic fire in the mid-1960s that destroyed the dairy and all the buildings that went with it. After some discussion, it was decided not to rebuild. We still have the farmland. Sunnydale still has the farmland. It's been developed, 4 pivot irrigation systems on it, and it provides from $150,000 to $190,000 of revenue annually for the school. Well, there were 2 major issues in building the school. Those issues were cash and materials. The constituents had agreed upon embarking on this endeavor that there would be no debt. One Friday afternoon, as building was progressing, Mr. Hartman, who was the superintendent of the school, realized that they were running out of money. So he called over to the conference office, which was here in Kansas City at that time, spoke to Elder Hutchins, conference president, and they pondered what to do. They decided to tell the work crew not to come back on Monday. They would bring them back on when there was cash available. Elder Hutchins was scheduled to speak in the St. Louis Central Church on Sabbath the next day. He got on the train and proceeded that Friday evening. The next day, as his custom was when he visited a church, he always gave a report on what was going on in the building at Sunnydale. By the way, there was a huge amount of interest in what was going on. As he gave his report, he noted that they were stopping building because of lack of funds and would not bring their builders back on until cash was available. As he was speaking, a little girl was coming up the center aisle, and in her hand she held a piece of paper, got up to the platform, held it out to Elder Hutchins. He looked at the paper, and there was a number written on the paper. He looked at it, and then he asked the congregation. He said, "Is this number for real?" The gentleman stood up in the back of the church. He said, "Yes, that number's for real. I committed to the Lord 1/2 of the sale of my business. It's sold. You'll have your money shortly." The amount written on the paper was $10,000, a very sizable sum in 1945. Workers were called back. There was no work stoppage. Then there was the issue of building materials. World War II had just ended. The U.S. industry was just now shifting from wartime production to domestic production. Lumber was hard to come by. The builders were close to running out of lumber. Brother Hartman had been in the building industry. He knew about lumber, and he called all over the country trying to find lumber. No luck. He decided to make one last call to a lumber yard in Jefferson City, which was about 50 miles south of Sunnydale. They had bought some lumber from this lumber yard. So he made the call. A gentleman on the other end answered. Elder Hartman just assumed that he knew who he was, and he said, "Well, I'm up here at Sunnydale Academy where we're building our school. We're about out of lumber. I'm wondering if you can help us out." The gentleman on the other end of the line says, "Well, I don't know, but I think they're spotting a carload of lumber in our lumber yard right now. Let me see." Presently, he came back on the line. He said, "Yes, they've spotted a carload of lumber in our yard. I really don't want to deal with distributing it out to a number of different people. If you can get your trucks down here, you can have the entire carload today." And then he asked a question. He said, "Who did you say this was?" Brother Hartman proceeded to explain to him again that we were building a school, Sunnydale Academy, up at Centralia. And the man's reply was, "I don't know anything about a school or Sunnydale Academy, but you get your trucks down here and the lumber's yours." Well, that left Mr. Hartman a little bit puzzled. He called the telephone operator back. "How did you make calls back in those days?" He called Central, right? Central would plug you in to the place where you were supposed to, the number or place you'd told them you wanted to talk to. The switchboard operator had plugged him in to the wrong lumber yard. The lumber yard she plugged him into was in Holt Summit, which was about 11 miles away from Jefferson City. Another Providence. I hope you're counting them. Well, how about something a little more up to date? It was the summer of 2010. We were in the middle of our recruiting season. My wife said to me one morning, "You're not sleeping? What's wrong?" So I proceeded to tell her my dilemma. On my desk, the office, there was a piece of paper with 14 names on it. Students that wanted to be at Sunnydale. I didn't feel I could recommend them for enrollment. I couldn't make a financial plan that would work for them. Their finances were too limited, and the school's finances were too limited also. I got her stock answer. Let's pray about it. I should tell you, she prays about everything. So we did. About 9 the following Monday, I was in my office. Brother Scott Hawkinson, who was our evangelism director, walked into my office, and his greeting was, "You got anything you want to pray about today?" And I shoved that piece of paper over to him with the 14 names on it, explained my dilemma, and so we prayed. Our school secretary was not there that day, so I opened and sorted the mail. There was an envelope from the General Conference headquarters. Figuring it was a bill, I put it on the bottom of the stack. We get bills from them. When I got to the envelope and opened it, I had kind of a spine-chilling experience. Inside was a check. Had a memo line for worthy students, anonymous, $100,000. How's that for a answer before you call? Well, I started making phone calls that very day, redoing student financial plans. 12 of the 14 students that were on that sheet of paper came to Sunnydale. Let's move back to the School of the Prophets. What was the second point I made? Our schools today need to consider themselves to be schools of the prophets, have the same goals and missions. Instruction in Bible history, the gospel, and doctrine have always been a part of the curriculum at Sunnydale since day one. Many of you might be aware of the Value Genesis study that began in the early 90s. Scholars studied the culture of Adventist youth, and they discovered something. What they discovered was that young people who were active in service remained active in service after they left the education cycle and moved into adulthood. We were fortunate. The time was right. Sunnydale began its School of Evangelism. School of Evangelism trains and provides opportunities for students for active service, both domestic and international service. The results of the School of Evangelism have been amazing. Today there are 10,000 Adventists on the Sunderban Islands just off the coast of India who were not there 10 years ago because of the evangelistic efforts of our students. They go there, they preach. Here's kind of the basic scenario. The local mission will put a church. There may not be any Adventists around. Put a church down, put in a couple Bible workers. Our students will go there to help hold evangelistic series. They usually hold anywhere from 10 to 20 series all at the same time. And they get to be part of the reaping of the harvest. Today there are over 75 buildings in Africa at schools and orphanages because of the efforts of our young people. One other mission of the School of the Prophets can't be ignored. Instruction was given on how to avoid the influence of the heathen nations around them. It seems odd to us that the worship of Baal was attractive to them. Guess what? Nothing's changed. The worship of other gods is still attractive to God's people, and particularly to his youth. It may not be an idol of stone, but there are plenty of other idols around. So how do you deal with that? You build a wall. Electronic media goes through walls. Smartphones, smart TVs, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and a whole host of others which I can't even name are influences today. There are more ways to become enmeshed in the moral decay of this world than ever before. Isolate and insulate does not work. It doesn't produce well-rounded Christians that can stand up to the wiles of the devil. Instruction in how to be in the world, but not of the world, is more important today than ever before. My notes say here it's time for me to wrap it up. Can you handle one more story? It was a Monday, mid-afternoon. I got a telephone call from this city. Lady on the line said, you don't know me? I'm not an Adventist, but I have a niece that I would like to have in your school. She said she has 2 cousins that go there. I understand you're going to be in this town recruiting this week. Would you please come by? And I agreed to come by. It was a Thursday evening. I got to her home, knocked on the door. She came to the door. The aunt did. I could hear the kids playing in the backyard. Invited me in. We sat down at the kitchen table and began to talk. After some conversation, she said, let me invite my niece in. She invited her in from the playground out back. She was an 8th grader at that time. She'd never been at Sunnydale Academy. So I had to give her the whole canvas of what goes on there. From 6:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night, and weekends and the whole thing. I got done with my canvas. I asked the young lady, I said, would you be interested in going to a school like that? And she said, yes, I would. After a little bit more conversation, the aunt dismissed her, and we began to talk finances. The aunt had already calculated what she and the members of her family could come up with. Surprise, surprise, it was not enough. I told her, I said, I'm going to have to go back to the school, check how much sponsorship money I can allot to this account, and I will get back with you in a couple days. I forgot one little detail. This young lady was a very attractive young lady. And I said to the aunt, I said, this girl has no business being in a public school. It was a rough district. I knew about the district, been there a number of times. The aunt looked at me and she said, I know that. That's how our conversation ended. I went back to the academy. Through some maneuvering, was able to have enough worthy student monies and some sponsorship monies, and a young lady enrolled in our school. She's a senior this year. About the end of January, I called the chaplain, and I said to the chaplain, has this young lady made any kind of commitment to Christianity or to Adventism? And his answer was no. He said, I can't seem to get the conversation going with her. I've tried several times. But he said, because of your call, I will try one more time. What he didn't know was she had been talking to other staff members. So he did. He initiated the conversation. It was about 2 months later. I was walking up the steps to the administration building. The young lady was coming down the steps, and she stopped. And she said, Mr. Bales, I want to invite you to my baptism. She was baptized 2 weeks ago. In closing, a couple texts I'd like to mention. Jeremiah 13:20. Lift up your eyes and behold them that come from the north. Where is the flock that was given you? Your beautiful flock. Jerusalem is about to be overtaken. The prophet asked the question of those in charge, where's that flock I entrusted to you? I consider every young person who wants to be at Sunnydale to be a part of the flock that we're entrusted with. Every one of them a treasure. Matthew chapter 6, Jesus gives some counsel on a number of things. How to give to the needy, how to pray, how to fast, and then he says some interesting things that you're familiar with. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. How do you store up treasures in heaven? We're not talking money, we're talking people. I can't think of a better way to store up a treasure in heaven than investing in Christian education for the youth that are part of our flock. I urge you to take part in the Sunnydale Fund the Mission, a student financial assistance campaign that we have begun. Because of your dollars, a Sunnydale student might be your treasure in heaven.